always begin with the African worldview, with the African asili, as it were, the asili, the cultural seed, the essence of the culture. Because that is our grounding. That is our frame of reference. And without an understanding of the African worldview, we really cannot critique European thought and European behavior effectively. We need that foundation that comes from outside of the European worldview. We cannot critique European thought and behavior functioning within their framework. We have to come outside of it. And for us, what comes from our nature is our understanding of the world, the way in which we relate to the world, and the seed from which our culture develops. And because the way the system of European control works is that you have to accept a concept of reality which makes them superior. If you deny that, their thing will not work, and they will lose their control.
All right, we are back at Africa's Reascension. Depending upon if any questions come up or any callers call in, 760-454-1111. That will determine if we need to go into some overtime. We're at the 1 hour mark now. The first clip was some Immortal Technique. I've been trying to get some of him into the show and finally found a good enough song to do so. That was a bit from him, and then the other 2 clips for our regular listeners was some stuff from the person who we will be talking about, Dr. Sister Marimba Ani. On our show page, we have a few of her pictures and 2 major books that she put out. And I have been remiss. At some point we're going to do a show on her small 74-page but powerful for 3 libraries book, Let the Circle Be Unbroken. That book doesn't get enough play, probably because she's calling Christianity on the carpet, and she's calling, but she's not calling on the carpet directly. She's getting us to look at how we're still African directly in that book. And so all of the people who want to talk about we're Americans, and I see one of those main people have left the chat. But anyway, that book just, breaks it down. Even when I did my debate, I don't think that old guy who lost the debate has that book or has ever heard of that book, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, because she lays it out very, 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 very well. So we will definitely do a show based on Let the Circle Be Unbroken. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal book. But tonight we're doing another chapter out of her big masterwork, Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. Tonight, reading from the show page, we're going to talk about her chapter, Universalism. We give an overview of it. Universalism trips up even the best of us. It disarms us and makes us think that it is a highly respected subject, when in actuality it moves us further away from our African. If you have your copy, dust it off and read along with us tonight. If you don't have a copy, shame on you. Go order it now and not from Amazon. Now, Dr. Ani in her book gets, uber deep on the universalism piece. For me, on a real sort of simple, but it goes over people's heads, again, even some of the best of us. In books and in talks, when people are talking about the universal values of this, and that, the universal meanings of this, and that, And then they go through examples. And I'm telling you, I challenge you to get a book that says that it's talking about universal this, and that, and the other, and look at the examples that they use. It's a whole bunch of Caucasoid stuff, maybe some Eastern stuff, maybe some Sufism, maybe some Wicca, the pagan European culture, all that sort of stuff, but hardly, rarely do they mention Africa. And I'm like, how in the blue hell are you going to talk about something in a universal context in the surface level, it applies to everybody? How are you going to speak on something being universal and you miss the second largest landmass on the planet that has over 200,000, 300,000 years of wisdom at being human? How are you going to miss that? And your major reference point is the newest quote-unquote human group on the planet, and it's only their ideas. But those ideas are good enough to be universal. The few exceptions is they may mention a little bit from Kemet, but in doing that, they're mentioning Kemet as a white civilization. Or, if they do mention Africa, it's some BS, misinterpreted, badly interpreted stuff from Africa that reduces her profundity. I've only come across one book in the time that I've been on the Caucasoid plantation that I work at, that at least when they was talking about different religions and stuff like that, they had a chapter on Ifa. And it was a decent enough chapter, you know. It was all right. It was written by Caucasoid. But I was shocked and surprised that he even mentioned the Ifa system of the Yoruba people and of African people in the context of the other religions that was mentioned in the book. But one book out of all the years that I've been there that even mentioned something about Africa in a universal context. So I want to implore the listeners now and the folks who pick up the archives, challenge me on that. Check it out for yourself. Go look at stuff that purports to be universal and see the dearth of African wisdom anywhere, but they still talking about it's universal. Or if they do mention Africa, it's watered down, milquetoast, BS that isn't real African philosophical thought. It was a European interpretation of African philosophical thought. But now my Marimba, of course, gets real, real deep. She breaks down the history and she breaks down the sociological implications of the universal idea as it is employed by white folks. And since we don't go deep enough in our analysis, we take this universal label and run with it. I say this to say, again, going back to my Face CIA book page, there's a whole bunch of folks that have sent me friend requests. I scrutinize every single one of them. I'll pull up your page, and I'm going to look at it and see what you said, see who you got friended, all that sort of stuff, because I don't want to further New Age thoughts, halfway, partially synthesized, syncretized African thought with other stuff, and that's the only way African thought gets validity if you can link it to Hindu thought, if you can link it to Christian mysticism, if you can. I don't need Africa to be validated through these new Johnny-come-lately systems. Africa can be validated on her own, being the oldest, being the longest, and being the most profound of Christian mysticism and Sufism and New Age thought and all that sort of stuff. So no. And so going through some of the pages, you know, universal this and universal that and da-da-da-whoop-de-whoop, and it's like, really, we're still doing this and calling yourself conscious, you muddying up the waters. Folks don't get to see Africa. Folks get to see some other stuff, but it ain't home. And so here in Yurugu and Universalism, the syntax of cultural imperialism, she breaks down what it is. And again, I'm so happy I got my original copy of Yurugu. I even titled it the Must Understand chapter. She starts it off with a beautiful quote by Baba Wade Nobles, which is sort of a paraphrase from Neely Fuller. You know, he changes up a few words and stuff. But power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. Mama Marimba was one of the first people to really, really get it to stick into my brain that we cannot use properly the same terms that Caucasoids use for our African liberatory efforts. It's a damn shame that we only speak English, so we, on some level, we have to try, and then we have to go through redefining it and trying to de-link it from its history and its larger socio-cultural implications. But on some other levels, you really can't do that, because either you have to spend 10, 15 minutes giving your definition for this English word so folks will understand it in your context and not the original context that they mean it in. Or if you don't go through that definitional process in the beginning, everyone in the audience will then automatically by default go to usually the most surface understanding of the definition, and potentially miss what you're trying to say because they've got the popular definition in their head when you're using that particular word, and they're missing the deeper stuff that you're trying to go with that word when you're trying to go there. And so that's another reason of the brilliance of her work, Yurugu, because she introduces the terms asili, utamawazo, and utamaroho. And she goes through and defines it. But the moment you create or use a different word from another language, you get to set the parameters. You get to set it up how you need to set it up to fully explicate what you're trying to say. And so while it may take a minute for folks to see this different word and then be able to pronounce it in their head and then get the definition, they have a new concept to deal with versus trying to de-link history and socio-cultural explanations of a particular word from a particular word to get to you how you're using it. And so power is the definition. Power is the ability to define reality and get others to respond to your definition as if it was their own. Most folks don't understand the whole history behind the term universal and universalism. Most people don't understand the social and cultural underpinnings of that term and how it is definitely being used to disarm African people from fighting against white folks and whoever else on that ideological playing field. We just run with the term because it sounds cute. And so Mama Marimba goes well into that understanding in Chapter 10. As Europeans present their culture to the world, they do so consistently in universalistic terms. This representation takes the form of a relentless command to universalize. It is our purpose to critically examine the nature of this universal that so dominates European rhetoric, using the concept of Vasili to demonstrate the way in which it functions to support and proselytize European ideology. The primary purpose of this chapter is to call attention to the most subtle and ideological effective manifestation of European cultural imperialism, the use of the semantics of universalism by European social theorists and liberal ideologues. And she's got liberal in quotes. She calls it the most subtle and ideologically effective manifestation of their cultural imperialism. So this isn't just some small, some folks take words and try to define them and make them all deeper than what they really are. No. She is walking through and like, this is one of the most effective way that they can spread their reality. They call their reality universal. They get you to think that it's universal. You don't need, and check this out, you then don't even need to look at or deal with your own stuff because their stuff is universal, so your stuff will fit right in there, so it won't make a difference. No. So now, she breaks down, she calls out Plato for the thoughts that he was putting together during his time to help shape the foundations of European cultural reality. And while he may not have been totally effective in doing what he wanted to do during the time he was alive, the Caucasoids who came behind him have definitely used his ideas to further their reality and push it further along. By camouflaging, we're on page 512. Where do I want to go? So now, beforehand, she sets it up. Throughout the book, she's talking about Plato's dichotomies, the related Platonic dichotomies of reason/emotion, knowledge/opinion, the whole and the part are involved in the logic of all European value distinction. And the universal and the particular are the good and the bad of European ideology. Because, again, we talk about Africa, African-centered, being centered in Africa. They attempt to disarm us by saying, well, you're talking a culturally particular way of doing stuff. But we're talking universally, which applies to everyone. No, they're not. They're lying to you. She continues, nationalism is particularism and therefore represents non-value in terms of European mental categories. And just as it became necessary for Europeans to represent their culture by the term civilization, it became necessary to represent their expressions of nationalism as internationalism, or their interests as the interests of all people, the small minority speaking for the overwhelming majority of the world. They don't just say, we are spreading European, American, white folks' democracy throughout the world. They say we are spreading democracy. That's one of those catchphrases, as one example. Now, this is a powerful paragraph here. By camouflaging, still on 512, by camouflaging European political interests as universal human goals, Europeans disarmed the victims of their imperialism. Culturally inspired flames of resistance to European aggression are extinguished by a sea of universalistic rhetoric. An example that she uses, we are seeking the good of humankind, while you are acting merely to further the ends of a narrowly defined nationalism. The circle is indeed a vicious one, for the more successfully European culture is imposed on the majority cultures, the more convincing becomes the rhetoric until we, first world intellectuals, struggle also to represent not our own, but the universal humanitarian interest, which, of course, has already been defined in terms of European value. We find it unintelligent to talk in terms of race. Their cultural imperialism, Caucasoid's reality, is housed, is flanked, is called universal. So therefore, you don't fight against it. Their particular way of reality is told to the world as being universal for everyone. So you don't fight against it. So you don't need to study who you are. You don't need to deal with all of that. We are dealing with universal ideas that fit everyone. An example of how this works can be demonstrated by the common contemporary use of the European value dichotomy of abstract good and concrete bad. African black children, it is said, are severely handicapped in that they tend to think only in concrete terms and are generally unable to think, quote-unquote, abstractly. An unfortunate reaction among people of African descent is to seek to prove that African children can think just as abstractly as white children. But they are jumping the gun, for the following questions have not been asked. What does it mean to think abstractly? What value does it have if, in fact, people do think abstractly? What does it mean in terms of the interests of the white society? When the charge is made, one could conceivably ask, what kind of abstraction? If European values are assumed, then one has no choice but to become as European as they, for they are most certainly best. And this is highlighted and underlined for me, the next one. There is only one way to break the hold, and that is to be able to recognize the phenomena of European cultural imperialism, no matter what form it takes. It disguises range from so-called universal religion to objective scholarship, from the abstractions of progress, science, and knowledge to the pseudo-altruistic goals of humanitarianism, internationalism, and world peace. Our objective is to make the subtle manifestations of European cultural nationalism more easily discernible. We are going over to Haiti for humanitarian reasons. No, you're going over there to keep the people in line, keep the people in check, and see if there's any other resources that you can extract from there. Our scholarship is objective. We have detached ourselves from the information. We are just giving it to you raw. No, you're not. One, that's not possible. You are a member of a culture. And based on being a member of a culture, when you look at X, Y, and Z, you are doing it through that particular cultural lens. And we ain't even got to talk about the universal religion lie. I've done enough shows talking about the religious piece. We don't even have to use time for that. But the concept of universal religions that fit everyone, is asinine, is stupid, is a lie, is non-historical. It's actually ahistorical. It's anti-historical, anti-cultural. You have to de-link yourself from who you are and your culture to be a part of one of these so-called universal religions. And just like my talk at Howard at ASCAC in March 14th through 17th, we even now are trying to blacken up this foreign stuff to soothe ourselves a little bit more instead of coming to hell back home and leaving this thing alone. There are no universal religions. All religions are tied to a culture, to a history, and to an experience of the particular people who created that particular religion. Period. It's the deification, as I think Dr. Ben said, religion is the deification of a people's culture. And so if you are a black Buddhist, you are deifying Hindu culture in lieu of your Africanness. It's okay to study it and like it and deal with it on different levels and all that sort of stuff, but you ain't a Hindu. You're a stolen African. That's a part of a history, culture, and experience that goes back at least 300,000 years. Yeah, see this? Oh my God, this beginning part is just so good here. On 513. The early Christian formulation exemplifies the function of European imperialism. While it is projected as a world religion, fashioned for the salvation of all people regardless of their cultural origin, it is in fact interpreted as a mandate for the spread of European culture and European control. It preempts other religious formulations in the terms of the syntax of European ideology because they are nationally or culturally defined, while the Christian statement supposedly has universal significance. And yet, of course, the reality is that Christian ideology is clearly defined in terms of European nationalistic endeavor, that is, in terms of European political interests. Simultaneously, as Europeans march throughout the world, quote-unquote, saving souls, peep this, the numbers of those who accept the rhetoric of their ideology are increasing. Christianity is a quote-unquote superior religion because it is quote-unquote universal. The indigenous religions of the would-be converts are inferior, quote-unquote, because they are nationalistic and culture-bound. Hence, European nationalism goes unrecognized while it spreads and destroys. That is the function of the universal in terms of European cultural imperialism. European nationalism goes unrecognized while it spreads and destroys. That is the function of the universal in terms of European cultural imperialism. The monotheistic statement corresponds to the objective of universal control, of monolithic control within the West and of European control throughout the world. If there is only one God to obey, let it be the Christian God, and she got that in quotes, I like that, of the West, i.e., the European himself. Monotheism conceptually conforms also to the normative structures of their Utamawazo, characterized as well by the universal imperative. Its political purpose, however, is to discredit other national gods and thereby other nations. Again, going back to my Face CIA book page, there was folks were talking about the oh goodness, what's the name of that DVD? There's a DVD out talking about African spirituality, and the almost like the first line in it is talking about African people have always worshipped one God, and they have always been monotheistic. Blah, 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 blah. And so I had to comment, and I was like, we need to be careful. And then I looked at some of the other comments, and it was like, yeah, that's a great DVD, and yeah, we've always had the concept of one God, stuff like that. And so I had to chime in. I was like, we have to be careful following this monotheistic concept. And then I mentioned Mama Marimba, who's doing it right now, and Occult B. Patek, who mentions it as well, that who says that monotheism is the height of cosmological understanding? Why is that the so-called, quote-unquote, height of cosmological understanding? If African people, if there are some groups on the continent that aren't monotheistic, then do we look at them as backwards and bad and not cosmologically mature? And so no one has really looked at this monotheistic piece. And Crazy Kamau, who long time ago understood the idea of challenging everything in European society, at some point I am going to pull all the pieces together and put together an article talking about that, because, I mean, it's almost across the board. I can count on one hand the people who have publicly attempted to challenge the monotheistic ideal. Myself, Mama Marimba, and Kwesi Rodney Patai Khan. That's three people. I'm sorry, four. Occult B. Patek. Ain't too many other folks doing that. And so we just take it on. And now we are possibly force-fitting the monotheistic ideal within African systems. If Caucasoids have lied to us about everything else, of course they are going to lie to us about religion and spirituality. I take zero cues from them in how to interpret African reality. And if they are pushing the monotheistic idea as the best, the most civilized, the most mature, and all that other stuff, Crazy Kamau is going to look at that and challenge that. And I hope other people do too. But that's just a little side, because she brought it up. So Mama Marimba did it, so that's why I went on that little side. So the use, 514. The use of the universal in the cause of European nationalism is classic. It displays a pattern repeated over and over again so that the imposition of all facets of the value system is facilitated. It is becoming more and more obvious that to neutralize the effects of the universalistic rhetoric, one need merely reject the universal as a viable goal, thereby eliminating the force of the rhetoric of European ideology. Indulge me as I read that again. It is becoming more and more obvious that to neutralize the effect of the universalistic rhetoric, one needs merely reject the universal as a viable goal, thereby eliminating the force of the rhetoric of European ideology. How do you do that? You call them on the carpet. When they start talking universal, say, where are you getting that from? Get them to name some people, name some books, name some thinkers who are dealing with what they're talking about. Almost across the board, it's going to be some Caucasoid. And so then you can ask them, so you just mentioned 5 white philosophers. How is this universal for everybody, especially in a world where 9/10 of the world are colored people? Ain't they got something to say about this? Whatever X is, whatever it is you're talking about? And either they'll say you tripping, or they'll attempt to bring up. So check this out. What they'll then do, if they're real tricky, is they may bring up somebody of another culture who is agreeing with them, but the person that they may be bringing up, more times than not, knows nothing of their own culture, or has personally, for some reason, rejected their culture. Because in the example that I just gave, somebody might say, well, Kwame Appiah from Ghana has said X, Y, and Z in agreement with these other white philosophers. And then if you don't know who he is, they'll say, oh, he's from Africa and he said that. Oh, okay, maybe it is universal. Kwame Appiah gave up his African culture a long time ago. He has yet to say anything positive about Ghanaian culture specifically or African culture in the general sense. In any of his books, in any of his articles, he's a proponent of cosmopolitanism, which, again, doesn't factor in African thought. It's about being everything of everyone, of every group, but don't be African. Mixing in everything from every group, but nothing deep from Africa. Y'all can be cosmopolitan with African food and the dress and dance and those surface level cultural aspects, but don't get deep with it and bring in some other stuff. 9 times out of 10 on the things that they say are universal, when you bring African philosophical thought into it, Africa has something totally different to say about it. Something totally different to say about it. And I would say that's one reason why they don't bring Africa into the discussion, but most folks don't know enough African philosophical thought to bring it into the discussion to know that, and so that's why they don't mention it. Understanding the nature of the European asili enables us to explain the various modes of European thought and behavior as issuing from the generative core of the culture. Universalism then becomes one of the themes that contributes to the creation of a cohesive and well-constructed whole. The entity is, in this case, a culture able to project itself consistently as superior to others and yet normative for them. European culture and reality is superior to everybody else, and it's the norm that everybody else should be dealing with. But by hiding it in universal terms, you don't see it as European cultural particularism. Let me continue. The need for such a relationship to other cultures is within the European asili, within its cultural germ. Universalism then becomes part of the natural unfolding of that asili. All manifestations of the universal in the culture finds their origin in the character of their Utama Rojo, that generative core that she was talking about. Europeans use universalistic terms to describe themselves,
They are the modern man, civilized man, universal man. It is above all the nature of their Utama Rojo that they project themselves onto the world. They are the world saviors and world conquerors and world peacemakers. They give religion and culture, civilization to the world. In this view, their national and cultural creations are those that are best for all people. It is ultimately the European obsession with unlimited power over other that brings universalism into their conceptions. This desire for and definition of power can be found at the base of all their cultural creations. At the base of all their cultural creations. I know people who are into the political system, and they are well-meaning, and they have such a good heart, and they really want to help our people, and I don't want to be seen as a hater, but unless we are creating a system outside of their political apparatus, at best, the most you can do is make this system a little bit more palatable for the people. That's the best you can do with your good heart, with your well-intentions, inside their political structure, inside their educational structures, inside all of their stuff. That is the best and the most that you can do. And I think we really got to understand that. We think we're being so liberation-minded and liberatory when we're in their educational stuff and their political stuff and all that other sort of stuff. If we're not doing something outside and separate from it, if we're not even talking about or inching towards creating the alternative from it, that's the best and the most that you can do. Make this system a little bit more palatable for the people that's in it. And that's a laudable goal for the time being while we architects work on creating the nation. But don't mistake being on the inside of their stuff as the totality of the movement, because it's not. Power for them is not force or energy. It is control. The origins of the universal in the European Utamawazo are precisely the same. Obsessive nationalism represents, for the European mind, the ability to control the universe. Obsessive nationalism represents, for the European mind, the ability to control the universe. By this process, the unknown becomes known. The disordered becomes ordered. Nothing is unknowable. The universal represents independence, that which controls, while the particular represents dependent, that which is controlled. And she continues. A subchapter in here is the myth of objectivity and the uses of scientism. Because again, as we stated at the beginning, you've got quite a few people, quite a few thinkers that talk about being objective, and you got to be objective to properly get at something. And so the compartmentalization of Europeans, I think now you have a whole, what word am I looking for? A whole department within philosophy called phenomenology, which is basically not being objective, which basically is saying you have to be in whatever you are doing to fully and properly understand it. You have to experience the phenomenology. You have to experience the phenomena to properly understand and talk about it. But within European philosophical discourse, you got a whole other group on the other side that's saying, no, you need to be objective, and once you get too deep into it, then there's certain things that you can't see, blah, blah, blah. And again, that goes back to the compartmentalization of the universe that Mama Marimba talked about earlier in the book. And the uses of scientism, what she talks about is basically the fact that as the Caucasoid power elite have moved away from Christianity, they have attempted to use their limited definition of science as their new God. And so if it can be scientifically proven, then it is correct. And if it can't be scientifically proven, it doesn't exist, or it's irrational, or it's less than. I.e., the reason why they give no deference to spirit reality, nothing like that, because they haven't yet, again, trying to control everything, been able to come up with ways to taste, touch, feel, see, and smell spirit and spirit reality. And so since it fails those aspects of their definition of science, it doesn't exist, or it's seen as less than. And since we follow them in thought and don't get deep enough, we got so many of our own people turning away from a spirit reality, not even wanting to attempt to fuse the spirit reality and tangible stuff together. They just throw the spirit piece all out because their ideological parents, Caucasoids, have thrown it all out. Black atheists, you are champions of white supremacy. Black atheists, you are champions of white supremacy. By attempting to throw away the 300,000-year nurturing of spirit within your African self, and saying that nothing outside of what you can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell exists, Caucasoids applaud you. Caucasoids cheer for you. White folks hope that black atheism spreads across the black universe, because then they will never have another Haitian Revolution on their hands. Because no one can give a cogent historical explanation for why Haiti was able to beat France the way they did. France militarily was the America of their time. And somehow, some way, these enslaved Africans on the place that we now call Haiti, Haiti, was able to whoop their ass, not only whoop their ass, but become fully independent. There is no quote-unquote logical, no quote-unquote rational explanation for that in their definition of logical and rational. They did the ceremony. They did the sacrifices. They called on African spirits. They called on African gods, and they got help from those forces to whoop France. It scared the hell out of Caucasoids then. It scares the hell out of Caucasoids now. And black atheists want to throw away that power. That's the only thing that Caucasoids fear, is our understanding and manipulation of the spiritual world. They don't fear y'all with guns. They make the damn guns. They don't fear y'all with guns. They make the damn bullets. I don't know no African manufacturers of bombs. They got the bombs, they got the bullets, they got the guns. So they don't fear you with guns. So now, myth of objectivity, so we set it up. We had just explained that in the 70s, there was some African and stolen African members of a white organization called the African Studies Association, ASA. And they challenged this group for being invalid and illegitimate and not really looking at Africa for Africa's sake. They was looking at Africa for European interest's sake. And so Dr. Clark had laid it out in an article actually called The Confrontation at Montreal. And so then he and some of the members there split, and they created their own thing called the African Heritage Study Association. So with that, now, here's how the crackers respond. So let us look briefly at this is on 525. Let us look briefly at the method of counter-argument used by their opponents. In an article entitled Politics and Scholarship published in the ASA journal, African Study Review, Benjamin Niemer, I think that's how you pronounce it, N-I-M-E-R, begins patronizingly by saying two good goals are in collision in African studies in the United States: the fostering of certain black interests and the untrammeled pursuit of scholarship. Check that out. The fostering of certain black interests and the untrammeled pursuit of scholarship. Now, just right there, before I even keep reading, with everything that we said beforehand, you should be able to point out some of the key words there on how the Caucasoids are setting up their argument and where they're going to go with it. So Dr. Marimba continues. The word certain is a signpost signaling the limitations, the quote-unquote limitations of the Pan-African position, while scholarship represents the universal and therefore that which is valid. This meant that the Pan-Africanists were opposing scholarship, an indefensible position. Like science, progress, or truth, scholarship is something no one wants to tamper with. Who among us, after all, wants to interfere with the pursuit of science or with the course of progress on which it takes us? We are encouraged to perceive these to be universal pursuits, not particular or parochial, like Pan-African self-determination. There is no question in Niemer's mind as to who will survive this collision. She continues. Niemer continues. Untrammeled scholarly inquiry is recognized as rational inquiry in the pursuit of truth, and very few people are in principle against the pursuit of truth. That's his quote. So now this is my Marimba talking. Of course not, because the pursuit of truth is nothing but a meaningless abstraction, a rhetorical phrase used to cloud issues, not clarify them. Niemer's article is riddled with these kinds of abstractions, which, interestingly enough, are designed to appeal to the emotions of his audience, while pretending to appeal to reason alone. By using these terms, he succeeds in erecting a wall of rhetorical disinterest designed to disarm the avowed African nationalist who is admittedly political and ideologically motivated. But the demystification of the syntax of universalism can prevent us from being intimidated by such terms. We must demand that the writer concretizes their abstractions and put meaningful content into them. What exactly is untrammeled scholarship? Whose truth? Certainly Niemer would not accept Fanon's definition of truth, which she lays out. Fanon's definition of truth. Truth is the property of the national cause. Truth is that which hurries on the breakup of the colonialist regime. It is that which promotes the emergence of the nation. It is all that protects the natives and ruins the foreigners. So that's Fanon's definition of truth. But that wasn't Niemer's definition of truth. So, continue. This is a case example now, so you get to see how it works. And I'm going through this example so when you start listening to the alphabet letter TV programs, CNBC, MSNBC, all of them, when you listen to the black-skinned president up there, when you listen to these pundits, you should now be equipped with an African sensibility to be able to hear the rhetoric of Caucasoid particularism being masked as universalism. Continuing, still on 525, going to 526. Niemer says the call for African control, quote, can be construed as advocating an undesirable means to justice and the implantation not of truth rationally arrived at, but of dogma, unquote. He cannot quarrel with the quest of African Americans for justice without embarrassing his own community of liberal academics, but he can condemn their method of pursuing it. His own method assures that his argument is not dogmatic. This position is a familiar echo from the days of the Southern student movement of the 60s. Basically, Niemer is concerned that he and others like him might lose their access to Africa and their control of the character of African studies. But his argument cannot be stated in terms of a parochial interest. It would lose all its force. He must argue in terms of universalism. He must claim his concern to be that African studies continue to represent truth rationally arrived at, which means you must play by our rules. The position of the Pan-Africanist doesn't have the hypocritical bent characteristic of European rhetoric. They are concerned that African studies represents an African perspective, and they say so. So again, this universal piece, this me talking now, this universal piece is disingenuous. Almost all the time, it is European cultural specificity that they're talking about, their cultural reality. They just don't say it. We say it. We don't play by their rules. We are attempting to build X, Y, and Z to help African people here in the diaspora and here on the continent. That's what we would say. Caucasoids would say, we want to spread democracy around the world to help humanity. Which, if you listen closely, they're saying we want to spread our values, our way of life, our reality throughout the rest of the world to make the rest of the world approximate white people. Then we have control over them, and then we, white folks, can rest peacefully at night. .526. The values of European ideology are discernible in Niemer's argument once we have become adept at recognizing them through the use of the African Asili concept. He says that some people argue that political or social objectives should be primary, and that although those espousing this position are often considered to represent radical, quote-unquote, political interests, they can be called reactionaries because if successful, check out this quote from him, because if successful, they would take men back to the time before they attain the level of civilization which entails respect for a disciplined search of rational truth. Because again, when they use the word civilization, they mean European culture. But instead of saying European culture, they say civilization. And no one wants to go back to the time before civilization existed, right? The entire force of the Western European worldview, the presuppositions of the European culturally structured thought, as well as the themes of their ideology, are behind this statement. The trick is to deal with it in just that way, as though it represents nothing more than European commitment, as opposed to the universality on which the force and success of Niemehr's argument depends. It is the political effect of the objectivity argument that is of paramount importance. And this is the reason Niemehr insists that in spite of the fact that objective truth may be unobtainable, it is still a standard to be set. Niemehr's argument proceeds this way. If the notion of truth has practical meaning, and 2, if scholarship is the search for rational truth, then 3, untrammeled scholarly inquiry is necessary for the good of the society. And then in parentheses she says, it is unnecessary to say that this means scholarly inquiry untrammeled by Pan-Africanism. His argument continues in a very Platonic vein. The good of society is justice for all its members and cultivation of human excellence. And he continues, by saying, therefore, quote, from the standpoint of a good society whose politics consist of such an ordering of human relations as will maximize the cultivation of human excellence, untrammeled scholarship is politically good. Oh, that's a bastard, boy, I tell you. 527. With this view of the good society, quote-unquote, scholarship cannot be subordinated to other goals. Scholarship is good in and of itself, a goal to which we can aspire. It's a basis for judgment. It is for this reason that scholarship should be autonomous from political action in our present world. I guess that's another quote from him, quote unquote. And Marimba calls it scientism at its best. In other words, scholarship, like religion, is unquestioned, and so its methodology becomes ideology. Niemehr is really saying, how dare these Africans question our authority? Failures, says Niemehr, are individual failures, unquote. But the point made by the African dissenters was that the ideological commitment and cultural environment of the Western European scholar in Africa has indeed been responsible for specific kinds of failures, most probably those which, from Niemehr's perspective, would not be recognized as such. And so then she proceeds to go into a few other folks who, Jacques Maquette, Kathleen Aberla, and stuff like that. So, again, the illusion of objectification in the social sciences facilitates the creation and encouragement of whatever social order to which the theorist is committed. And she continues. So that was a direct example of how their myth of objectivity within a universal context helps to serve them. They've got certain code words that they put out, and if you're not careful, they are designed to trip you up and take away your cultural specificity, your culturally specific argument. When in reality, it is one cultural specific argument against another cultural specific argument. They, Caucasoids, have just put their thing in universal terms. And if you strive for the universal, they got you, because then you are striving for European reality. And so she has another section, the implications of European internationalism, where she looks at and goes through again, how they use the rhetoric historically in the context of a few wars and how they fight, and she looks at the history of it and stuff like that. And I have all this highlighted, so this must be uber important here. If evidence is needed, this is on 530 and 531. And again, right now we're talking about their use of the term internationalism versus their specific cultural parochialism. If evidence is needed of the real European objective vis-a-vis internationalism, one need only observe the present movement to build a European conglomerate of 12 nations considered to be part of the European community. This movement is clearly not based on a love of humankind, but rather the pursuit of power. Europe wishes to speak formally with one voice. We are actually witnessing the attempt at the formulation of the European Empire. And this is now European community here, and it's now, the EU, basically. Referred to in an article by Jean Holberg as the process of Europeanization, the movement seeks to break down barriers between the 12 European nations, between European ethnicities, and to encourage the growth of a European national consciousness. Ravina Bey has aptly chronicled this process of European supranationalism. The 1957 Treaty of Rome was a major step in this process of consolidation, to which amendments were made and was approved in 1986 by the European Community's Councils of Ministers. The new legislation is called the Single European Act. Of economic significance is the European currency, a monetary system, and the use of the European currency unit, what we now call the euro. According to George Corvitaris, ratification and implementation of the Single European Act and Final Act would replace the present diverse population of Europe with a mammoth state representing one of the world's most extensive array of populations to fall under the jurisdiction of a single government and legal system. If successful, this will merely be a formally institutionalized manifestation of an already existing reality. A European national conscience is not new. All of European history is the story of the development and reaffirmation of that consciousness. The present process of Europeanization means what the collective European objective has always meant, the consolidation of power. This kind of internationalization is an expression of intense European nationalism, all the more essential for Europe since Europeans and their descendants actually represent only 10% of the world's population. That's another piece for anyone who follows population control and the population debate. When they talk about the developing nations are having too many children and it is putting a strain on global population. Really? Global population. Africa and African people everywhere except America, unfortunately, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why, are above the national birth rate average. Every single African nation on the continent and practically everywhere else in the diaspora is above national birth rates. America, black folks here, we are underneath, or maybe right at. And part of the reasoning is they have us aborting what was the number? I think like 5 million kids last year. It might even be worse than that, something like that, 3 to 5 million, something. So we are aborting a whole bunch of our futures away. And then our diet is horrible. A whole bunch of us can't have kids, all this sort of stuff. This American lifestyle is all of those are contributing factors to why our numbers here aren't above the birth rate. Every single one of the European Caucasoid countries are below the national birth rate. Below means that they are not reproducing enough children to replenish themselves when the old folks die off. So while some folks don't like to talk about this population piece because the white nationalists, the overt white nationalists have taken that up and they talk about it a whole lot and they really are pushing it. There are regular scientists, regular white demographers who don't have any, connection, who don't have any known, let me be specific, who don't have any known connections to white nationalist groups or all that. They are sounding the alarm. And there's a few of those clips that are on YouTube, and I think I even put it on my channel, at Africa's Reascension YouTube page. White folks are becoming extinct or something like that. But these aren't your quote-unquote, loud, racist white folks saying it. These are scientists and demographers that are saying, look, everywhere in the world where white folks are, except America. Now, again, for them here in America, their numbers are a little bit above. But everywhere else, all through Europe, and all the other places where they invaded and are presently temporarily controlling, their numbers are below the birth rate. And one Caucasoid, there's a few who have written about it, but the one whose books that I have, I got both his books. One is called The Birth Dearth, and the other one is called Fewer, by a Caucasoid named Ben J. Wattenberg, Wattenberg. Since the 1950s, they have been having population conferences. First looking at all the population data, and then probably secretly sitting around trying to figure out how in the hell are we going to increase our birth rates, because we're slowly dying. None of them, as far as I've been able to find, are given a prediction on when they're going to die out, when they are going to become extinct. But I'm sure some folks are talking about it and playing with some dates, and they just don't want that to be public. So I said all that to say, when they talk about a crunch on the population, that is a specific dig to us, because they are not reproducing at rates fast enough, if you keep projecting, that will be able to sustain white people being on the planet. So it's on one sense it's an alarm being sent for what I just said, and it's another sense for it's an alarm that black folks are having too many kids and we should help kill them off. Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood, Eugenics 2013, all that sort of stuff. So that expands a little bit of what Mama Marimba was talking about in that sense. They're only 10% of the world population, and she wrote this book, 20 years ago, so they're probably a little bit less now than 10% of the world population. But I digress. So she continues, and this internationalism piece, but I really let me get this out. We got some time. This is on page 534. The nature of the European assembly is to seek power over other. Other is that which presents itself as threatening because it is not controlled from the European center. The need to obliterate difference issues from European xenophobia. The same need to maintain difference of status so that there can be an other that the self can control. Here we have the formula for the creation of power. In the European Asili, cultural expression and cultural aggression become synonymous. Cultural expression and cultural aggression become synonymous. Why? By focusing on 534, by focusing on positive or healthy manifestations of the phenomena of culture, alternative possibilities become visible. If the particular context of the cultural entity is the natural environment in which humans learn to value from each other, then ultimately transcultural or international respect can only exist to the extent that particular cultural philosophies are compatible with the idea of mutual respect. Nationalism is the love of a people for themselves and their commitment to their group survival. It is the affirmation of the cultural self. It is what motivates the pockets of resistance to European oppression. While European nationalism, on the other hand, has meant the mandate to universally impose its European ideas. So there's a whole bunch in there, and so I want to go back. If I set up a school that is based off of African history, African thought, African ideas, Columbus, Shakespeare, and de Tocqueville are no longer highly important in my life. If I set up an African spiritual temple in which we practice Ifa, Akan, and Vodun, Christianity, Judaism, Islam no longer becomes important in my life. If I set up a society where family and family development is primary as a man and a woman, your homosexual agenda doesn't affect me. If I set up a political system based off of a synthesis of the best of my African past, your political system, voting in your system, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, no longer has real meaning in my life. If you do all of those African things that I just said, you have essentially divorced yourself from European reality on those levels, in which case European reality becomes less and less important to you. You are then taking your energy out of their thing and putting it into your thing. Caucasoid reality cannot exist on Caucasoid energy alone. It would have died out long time ago because it would have fed off of itself and killed itself based on how they set it up. I ain't got no control over it. It must feed off of the energy of other cultures, not dealing with their culture, but wanting, needing, must having to be within the European reality. And that's how it has and is sustaining itself. So what Mama Marimba is saying there, cultural expression and cultural aggression are synonymous to European. If you do that African stuff, you're not doing my stuff. So therefore, you're at war against my stuff. So therefore, I must stop you from doing your stuff. And that's the whole struggle right there. When you attempt to blacken up and Africanize up their stuff, you give them a little bit more life. You give them a little bit more hope. You put some more breaths back in them. When you pull yourself out of it, when you detach yourself from it, and when you get back into your stuff in your way, then you give life and breath and energy to your stuff. I mean, to me, it is just so simple. It's just so obvious. But now we've got, and on some levels, it was that easy for us to understand in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was real obvious for us to see then, especially because they had laws on the books saying, niggas, we don't want you here. So we were forced to do our own stuff. And on a whole bunch of levels, not all, but on a whole bunch of levels, a lot of our stuff was thriving, and it was good. And the money was circulating, it was generating, and the families, you know, were could have been better, but they were a lot better than what they are now. And all that sort of stuff. And Congress always was looking at this and was like, oh, wait a minute. We even let them create a Black Wall Street? No, we got to blow that shit up. How can we get this money that they're spending on themselves and doing for themselves? How can we break up all these black businesses and these schools and all of that? Let's go ahead and integrate them into our stuff. And we are still suffering from that today. Integration and assimilation. I know there's some little nuanced differences between the terms, but when we integrated and assimilated into European reality wholeheartedly by the 70s, our downward spiral sped up exponentially to the point where we're at now. Beforehand, white folks would create the black exploitation films and pay us to be in them. And we, you know, just wanting to see a black face at the movies, we would go and support it. Today, the black exploitation is Snoop and Lil Wayne and Nelly and Rick Ross and all of them. And so white folks funded and paid for it, but it's us doing it now. You catch that? Beforehand, white folks had to do it, and then they would pay us to be in it, and then we would then pay to go and watch it and check it out. Today, it is us that's doing it. White folks are still paying for us to do it. but you see a little bit of the difference there. And a quick note, a quick side note, I've seen a few folks have been up in arms with what Lil Wayne made the reference to Emmett Till, banging up the coochie like I'm Emmett Till. While it was a stupid statement, while, you know, I can see it being offensive to Emmett Till's mother and all that sort of stuff, my big question is, what in the hell else did y'all expect from Lil Wayne? I'm not marching, protesting, wanting him to be. I'm not expecting nothing culturally salient to come out of Lil Wayne's mouth. Period. Even when he did one little stop the violence thing with KRS, that was just for money, and he went right back to talking the stupid stuff immediately after that. So that's all I'm saying. What else would you expect from Lil Wayne? So, I mean, yeah, it was stupid, and Epic Records is pulling that song, or they're going to, bleep that line out or re-release it without that line or that song on there or whatnot. But what else would you expect from Lil Wayne? Yeah, that's all I got to say. But, cultural aggression and cultural expression are synonymous to Caucasoid, because if you're doing your stuff, you're putting energy into your stuff. And thereby you're taking energy and resources out of their stuff. But then she continues and says, by doing that, also alternative possibilities become visible. And so for folks who notice and can see and can catch it, they're like, oh, wow. So this way that I've been doing stuff in the mainstream way isn't the only way I can do certain things? Wow. There are other ways to think about this. There are other ways to look at and venerate the creative forces of the universe. There are other ways to set up educational systems. You see, once you start, that's why they see cultural expression and cultural aggression as synonymous. Because for folks with the eyes to see and the ears to hear, it could become the domino effect. And they'll start asking those type of questions. And they'll start seeking some answers to that. And for some people, it may lead them to the African reality. Hopefully, however, they get to sidestep the pitfalls of the niggas we have in our camps who will still be blacking up their stuff or horribly reduce the deepness of our stuff to make it look like their stuff. Because if not, you get a whole bunch of folks that fall into that trap, into that pitfall. Then we got to expend energy to pull them out of that and get them back on the direct African